My name is Ashley Watson. I'm currently the president of the Criminal Justice League on campus. I'm a senior here on campus also for criminal justice and law and policy. This event is co-sponsored by the Social Work and Criminal Justice Program, also with Social Work and the Criminal Justice League. So today, Brad Graham is here from the Tacoma Police Department. He's a detective, been on the force for 31 years. He'll be, and he's also a part-time lecturer here at UWT too. He'll be discussing multidisciplinary teams, and there will be a Q&A after he's finished. And we emphasize if you have a question to just go up to the microphone. And so let's give a warm welcome to Brad Graham.
Thank you, Ashley. Well, good evening, everybody. My name is Brad, and as she said, I work currently with the Tacoma Police Department, and I've been there for about 31 years. And I'd just like to say a little bit about myself and where I'm coming from as we begin talking about MDTs, or the multidisciplinary team. My background as a detective has been in the Special Assaults Unit, where I work with child physical and sexual abuse, child death investigations. I've been in the Domestic Violence Unit, and I've been in the Homicide Unit. And I bring that up because each of those units, I have learned that working with my partners out in the field, and not my law enforcement partners, but with my multidisciplinary partners in the field, has made my job easier. Anybody who is in here who has worked in the field, particularly in the field of social work, had to look at this thing and go, you know, oh my God, you're having a cop talk about working with multidisciplinary teams. And I can see by some of you who are smiling, those of you that must have been in the field, you know exactly what I'm talking about. Could there be a bigger stumbling block to working as a team than having law enforcement on your team? We are the biggest stumbling block. And all I can say is I wish I knew back then what I knew now about working as a multidisciplinary team. And so my purpose tonight is to give sort of a brief overview of what my concept of a multidisciplinary team is, and what it can do for us across the spectrum of working with our clients, with our patients, with our victims. And you're going to hear me use those terms interchangeably tonight, because we are together on this, and whether you refer to them in my field, they're victims. In the social work field, they're often clients, and from our medical or treatment providers, they may be patients. But the reality is that it's all one goal. We are working with somebody who is in crisis and either cannot or will not advocate for themselves. And so we get to be their voice. We have to be their voice. We have to assemble the team on their behalf. And that's what I'd like to talk about here tonight. And again, I'm going to draw on predominantly my experiences in the child abuse field, because I think that really has lent itself to me in working in these areas. And I'm so glad that we have students here from both disciplines, from the social work side and the law enforcement side, or the criminal justice side. This is a very unique system that UWT has in reference to this. I haven't seen it anywhere else, but the merging of those two fields. And I hope that by at least from hearing what I have to say, you understand why I think that the two working together is so hypercritical. So here's my cute drawing for the night. I'm going to equate working as a multidisciplinary team or without working as a multidisciplinary team with like working in the dark. And so what we have in front of us are 6 experts in their field, and not a single one of them have got this thing right. I think clearly working in the dark is a problem. We have blindfolded experts who couldn't tell us what the big picture is. And that really is what I think working without an MDT is like. Individually, they have their ideas. Individually, they are working on the problem, and individually, they believe they have solved the problem for themselves. It is not until they can collectively share their experiences, collectively talk about what they see, what they hear, what they experience, what they've gathered from working on the project, that we can then begin to see what the picture is going to look like. Otherwise, we're going to remain in the dark. If that's not an elephant, but it's one of our clients, it's one of our victims, It's one of our patients. It's somebody who is in crisis and needs the team to fix the problem, or at least get them on the process, on the road to being healthy again and being safe, and throwing in the concept of justice. Then it's not so funny anymore when we are working individually, for all intent and purposes, against each other, and not being able to solve the problem. I think we need to do just a little bit of a brief history lesson and maybe how this started, or give you an example of why I think this is important. As I said, I rely heavily on the child abuse side. That's where the bulk of my career has been spent, and will be the reference point or the centerpiece for what I believe is a properly functioning MDT. So from a history standpoint, for us it began with what's called a Child Advocacy Center, and we are very fortunate to have one right here in Pierce County serving the children in our area. The CAC is sort of like a centerpiece, if you will, of the child abuse field. It acts as a conduit through which all of the other disciplines can function. The CAC in and of itself, a multidisciplinary team is not an investigative team in and of itself. The MDT doesn't get to tell any one discipline what they should or shouldn't do, or can or can't do. So they're not an investigative body. They're not a replacement for any one single discipline. But what they do is bring together, as a collective, all of the different people who are working on the elephant to figure out what that elephant is. And it began for us with a guy named Bud Cramer. Bud Cramer was he was a state legislator in Alabama, and he became a prosecutor. His passion was law. And in the early 80s, he took up the cause of prosecuting child abuse cases. And what we learned from him is that he struggled at the beginning of his career with dealing with child abuse cases, not because of the subject matter. He understood it, and he had a zeal for wanting to prosecute it, but he felt that the system as a whole was traumatizing children, and he wasn't sure that it was the right thing to do to constantly put small children through that process. He felt that kids were falling through the cracks because all of the different people that got to touch a child abuse case were not touching it together. We're not communicating with each other. He found that law enforcement didn't want to communicate with CPS because he felt that CPS had no concept of holding somebody accountable. All they wanted to do was treat people and do the social work aspect of it. He found that social workers didn't want to communicate with law enforcement because they felt that the cops don't get it. They don't understand that we have to treat people, and that there has to be some care for what we leave behind when we work these types of cases. And so Bud thought that, all right, I'm going to start to pull people together, and I'm going to actually have them start talking about what they do. And his aha moment, those who have maybe had the opportunity in the field to have listened to him speak at some point, his aha moment was dealing with a very small child, a 6-year-old kid on his caseload who had been both physically and sexually abused. And this child was bounced around from discipline to discipline so that everybody could do their particular piece. And he said it was when this kid, he was asking questions as a trial lawyer would do, interviewing his witness prior to putting him on the stand, getting the case together. And this kid looked at him and simply said, I've already talked about all of this. Don't you people talk to each other? And at that point, he's like, that we had to take a lesson from a 6-year-old kid. All of the brilliant people we have at the table, all of the disciplines that we have here, it was a 6-year-old kid who put the concept together that says, you got to talk to each other. I've told my story. I've told it a number of times. You guys need to listen. You guys need to listen as a whole. And so that's what he decided that he was going to put together. He was going to put together a multidisciplinary team for each of his cases, and he was going to have the social workers communicate with law enforcement. He was going to have law enforcement communicate with the treatment providers. He was going to have the medical people come to the table and talk about why a particular injury did or didn't make sense in the concept of physical abuse, and why a story that we were being given by an offending parent doesn't seem to make sense. And then what happens when we're done with this? And where does this kid go? And where does the family go? All of those questions that no one single discipline really had responsibility for. I mean, technically my job's done when I make an arrest. As soon as I put the bracelets on somebody and take them off to jail, I'm kind of done. Once the case gets into trial, the prosecutor's kind of done. Once the kid has gone into therapy and completed the therapy process, they're kind of done. Once the doctor has, so you get the point. But then what happens when there's still questions left behind? Where do we direct this family, this kid to? And so we need to recognize that there may not be a logical end to this person, this victim, this client, this patient. And that's what Bud talked about, and that's where he created the child advocacy model and said, we got to do a better job. We have to do a better job if we expect these people to heal. And so we in our field, we owe it to Bud. And I think the same can be said across the board. You pick a discipline, pick a topic, pick a social issue that wouldn't be better served through that process. So with that being said, I'm going to tell you that I hear this all the time. I have the opportunity to teach at the Law Enforcement Academy here in Washington State. I've had the opportunity to teach at law enforcement academies all over the place. I had the opportunity to teach at a law enforcement academy in Singapore last year as part of a team that went out to teach child abuse investigation skills. And every single place I've gone, I've had this same statement made to me by cops. I'm a cop. I'm not a social worker. And truth be told, I'm sure if I had been mic'd up from day one 30 years ago, you probably would have heard me say the exact same thing. We all say it. I don't need these crisis intervention type skills. Yeah, I'm sure it's important, but it ain't my gig. My job is to go out and to arrest people. My job is to enforce the law. That's what social workers are for. Bring them in. And again, I can say, if I only knew then what I know now. I came into this field, like probably most young cops do, with a couple of very definite goals in mind. I wanted to solve mysteries. I wanted to track murderers. I wanted to chase bank robbers and eat donuts. And I felt that this was the field that would allow me to do that. Having said that, I can tell you that over the course of a career, those calls, those options are few and far between. We don't get that many murders. We don't get that many bank robbers. What do we find ourselves doing out in the field? We find ourselves more often than not dealing with the same social issues that everybody else in society is dealing with. A typical day for me on the street, a typical day for any law enforcement officer on the street is not. The rare exception is being called out to the scene of a murder. The rare exception is being called out to the scene of a bank robbery. Sure, it happens, but not as often as television wants us to think. What do most law enforcement officers do out in the field? The things that other people in society don't want to deal with. Homelessness, trafficking victims, suicidal subjects, mental health. This afternoon, I went home this afternoon to let the dog out, because that's a pretty glamorous life that I have. And so at lunchtime, I'm going home to let my dog out. So from the time it takes me to travel from Central Station, which is over near the mall, to the Northeast Tacoma area and back, I listened to the North Precinct on the radio, the police radio system. That's what I was geared into. The city is divided into multiple precincts or sectors, and they have different radio frequencies. And so I was monitoring North, and of all the calls that went out in the time it took me to drive from station home and back again. So we're really talking about 35 minutes or so. In that time frame, how many bank robberies do you think happened in that time frame? How many murders did we have during that 35, 45-minute period? The radio was busy, and what were the cops being dispatched to? There was a man downtown who was threatening to jump out of a window. There was a woman who had been checked herself into St. Joseph's Hospital and ran out of the ED and onto 19th Street in her hospital gown, back untied, and was running in and out of traffic screaming at cars. There was one barking dog complaint. That was all right. And then there were 2 different calls of business owners in the Stadium District who were calling to report that there was some type of homeless person who was inhabiting their doorway, and it was impeding customer traffic. Traditional law enforcement, chasing people, doing that kind of stuff? No. No, it was dealing with the social issues that we face in society. And not to say that I'm a social worker. I'm not a social worker. I am a cop. But I do have to deal with social worker issues. I do have to have the crisis intervention skills to be able to process what the community wants from me at that moment. They weren't interested in me trying to track down a murderer, because there wasn't one at that moment. But there were real problems that people were having to deal with at that time. So while I don't call myself a social worker, I have all the benefits of being one, just not all of the training that they get. So I'm more often going to call myself what I would call a first aid social worker. That's kind of what I am out there in the field. I'm a first aid social worker. I'm that first responder who has to assess that problem and then figure out where it needs to go. And how do I deal with somebody that doesn't need to be arrested? This isn't somebody I want to take to jail. So what else am I if I'm not a social worker while I'm out there? So how about from the other side? About a decade ago, I started teaching a small block at the CPS Academy up on Delridge in Seattle. And they wanted a class put together called Working with Law Enforcement, as if we were maybe some kind of aliens. So if you happen to see this law enforcement person, don't touch them, just look at them and, feed them periodically and keep your hands and feet away from their mouths and you'll be okay, and, that kind of stuff. So they wanted this class put together. And so we started doing it. And, I got to tell you, when I was up there, it was the exact same thing, just, reverse the nouns on the sentence. I would listen to social workers say, why are you here? We don't really need training in police or criminal justice. We're social workers. We're not cops. I just don't need it. I don't want to know about criminal law. I don't need to know how the criminal justice system works. I don't interrogate people. I treat people. So why are you here? And the reality is, as a social worker, how can you say you're not going to deal with the criminal justice process? It's going to happen. If you're with CPS, you're going to have to talk to the accused person. You're going to have to talk to the offender. You're going to have to understand where they work. If you want to be in drug court, you're still going to have to work with offenders. If you work for adult protective services, if you're in mental health services, you're going to come across people who have offended against others. You're going to be asked to make assessments about their suitability to reunite with another family member or a vulnerable family member. Picture yourself being a CPS worker and being asked to make an assessment about whether or not this person can be returned to their family or can be back with their family, and not having any idea how to talk to an offender. And how do you make an assessment if you don't have the understanding of what that looks like? How do you assess credibility without understanding what they've been through or where they've been? It doesn't make any sense to me. And I'm not saying that you have to interrogate, but I am saying that you have to make the appropriate assessments. That's what social workers are going to do out there in the field. The courts are going to rely on your assessments. The kids, the families, the elder, whoever it is that is your client base, they're going to rely on your assessment. Can you make those assessments without at least understanding the dynamics of a confrontation type interviewing skill, without being able to call somebody on what they're saying, to not just automatically take somebody at their word, and be able to at least question it to the point where you have an understanding of where they're coming from, they have an understanding of where you're coming from. You're going to work with domestic violence victims. You're going to work with sex trafficking victims. You're going to work with sexual assault victims, the bulk of whom know who their suspect is. It should be no surprise to anybody in here that the bulk of our violent crimes are committed by known persons, somebody who knows the victim, who has a connection to the victim. The stranger assaults are the exception. The stranger assaults are far more rare than contact with somebody that they know. So if you are more likely to be sexually abused, physically abused, commercially sexually exploited by somebody that you know or somebody that you have a connection to, how do you, as a social worker, connect with that client without having a complete understanding of what they're going through, how that suspect is able to manipulate them, how that suspect is able to stay in their lives and get them to do what it is that the suspect wants them to do? If you have that understanding about the dynamic of that criminal process, of that criminal mind, then you're in a far better position to make those assessments, to offer that help. If you have no understanding of that and you sit with a client and you offer guidance or you offer advice and you have no idea what they've been through or how that dynamic of manipulation works, how that grooming behavior does happen, you're going to lose that credibility with them. You're not going to, exactly, see? All right, he agrees with me. So I'm a firm believer that you, as a social worker, yeah, treatment is probably going to be your fundamental goal. But you still have to understand the psychology of being an offender. You still have to understand the dynamic or the tactics that an offender uses to keep somebody in their grasp. And if you can understand that, then you're going to be in a far better place when it comes to working with your clients. So yeah, you're not a cop, you're a social worker. But the lines are going to blur, and they are going to forever blur. As I've said, we're each our own discipline, and we're not going to be all that interchangeable at 100%. But we are going to have to, at times, do each other's job. Because we are all in this room, those of us that are going to enter the field of social work or those of us that are going to enter the field of criminal justice, whatever that looks like, whether it's parole or law enforcement or corrections or prosecution or defense. In social work, whether you're going to work with any victim of violence, whether it's domestic violence or sexual assault or commercially exploited or elder abuse, pick whatever you want. If you're going to be an MHP or you're going to be an advocate, whatever field you're in, you're a first responder. We're used to hearing that term first responder as police and fire, the people who answer that 911 call, but it's the same thing. You're going to be that first contact with somebody, that first contact with the system. And that very first contact with the system, in my experience, is when that client is going to decide whether or not they're going to stay with the system. You're it. That's it. There might not be anybody else. There might not be a second chance. And we can sit here and go, but I want to bring an expert in. Well, of course you do. We all want to bring in an expert for whatever it is that we're confronting. But it may not happen that way. That victim might look at you, that client might look at you, that patient might look at you and say, you got 2 minutes here. What is it you're bringing to the table here? I like it, I stay. I don't like it, I leave. And then we might have lost them. Who knows? We might have lost them forever. You think if I'm standing negotiating with somebody, and I have, who's standing on the ledge of the Narrows Bridge, I can say, wait here, I'm going to go get a social worker and an MHP and an advocate. Try not to slip. I'll be right back. It doesn't happen that way. You're it. You're there right now. And sometimes in this field, we have to learn to be able to flip that switch. I went into this call thinking I'm there to investigate, and all of a sudden, I'm going to be that first aid treatment responder now. And that's what's going to happen until somebody else can get here to assist me. You're going to be on the front lines of all of those social problems. And you got to be able to go back and forth, whatever your job is. You're in law enforcement. Okay, so do I need to be able to flip that switch and go between investigate and treat? I mean, my job is to investigate. Except the call that I just went on is the subject with a weapon making threats. I can tell you as a career law enforcement officer, when that call comes out, I know what I'm thinking as I'm driving to the scene. Subject with a weapon making threats. I'm preparing myself for battle. I'm preparing myself for what, in all likelihood, is going to be a violent confrontation until I get there. And I realize the man with the weapon making threats is a suicidal, despondent person who's at wit's end and has believed that they are in a total crisis mode because they just lost their job and now their family is threatening to leave. Is this now that violent confrontation cop suspect issue, or are we talking about flipping the switch down and going into crisis intervention mode? And am I now the social worker on scene until somebody else can get there to help me? You're the social worker who's been sent out because a school counselor has called and said that for the last week, these kids have come to class. These elementary school kids have come to class and they're dirty, and I think one of them has lice, and they look underfed, and they're just not with it. They're not paying attention in class. There's some type of neglect issue going on, and it's affecting their ability to learn. And so there you are arriving at the school thinking, I am totally in assessment treatment mode. I'm going to problem solve with these kids and figure out what I need to do to get them back on track, and what do I need to do with their parents to get them back on track. Until you start talking to them and you're 10 minutes into your interview with them, and they start to tell you that they're being physically and sexually abused at home. The game just changed. We're not in treatment mode now, we're in investigative mode, and you're it because you're there. Or maybe you're the mental health professional. And again, when I bring these examples up, I wrote them down because they're all calls that I heard over the radio in the last couple of weeks. You're the mental health professional who was just sent over to Wright Park because there's what appears to be a homeless woman in the park who is, for lack of better, the call said, yelling at trees. So we're going to send an MHP over there to talk to that woman and see what kind of problem solving we can do. 2 minutes into the conversation with her, you realize she's not a mentally ill homeless person. She's a domestic violence victim who fled her house because her husband sold her into commercial sex to pay off a drug debt. Flip the switch. You have to be able to understand the dynamic that is in play if you want to talk to that person, if you want to capture that person to the point where you can get them to wherever it is that they need to be to work the problem. Again, it would be great if we can say, I'm going to freeze the scene and I'm going to bring in help. And if you can do that and the time works, that's great. That's, of course, what we should all do. Again, I'm a first aid social worker. I'm not a surgeon social worker. So I want to bring in somebody who has that skill set, who knows how to do this long range. But while I'm standing there talking to the person who now has a gun to their own head, I don't have the time. Or those kids, because you're in school and they just disclosed sexual abuse and the school bell is going to ring in 10 minutes, and if you don't make a decision now about what to do next, they're going to have to get on that bus and go right back to where that abuse happened. It's not a question of a dirty kid. It's a question of a sexually abused kid. So really at that point, it doesn't matter what your job title is. You're it. And you have to be able to understand that these roles have completely blurred, and be able to flip that switch and get to where you need to be. So when I talk about an MDT, or what I mean by it, the composition is anybody who is going to touch that client. Anybody. Traditionally, we think of this, it's going to be a social worker, law enforcement, maybe the forensic interviewer if they're a kid, maybe the medical, the medical staff, the doctors who do the treatment. Certainly we want victim advocacy in there. We want mental health therapists to come in. If there's been a crime, then absolutely. I want the Attorney General's office, and I want the prosecutor, I want the defense attorneys, I want all of these people involved. But can you think of others that need to be at this table? People who are going to be able to have to touch this person long range, depending on what age set or what type of problem we're talking about. How about teachers? How about adult sexual assault advocates? How about probation officers, treatment providers? How about the advocates who work with our commercially sexually exploited teens? The ones that get to go into the schools and to help and help a vastly underserved population. All of these people have to come to the table because all of these people at some point or another are going to touch that victim. And I would defy you to come up with a social problem that isn't workable as an MDT, that wouldn't benefit from an MDT. And I'm telling you as somebody who has worked homicide cases, domestic violence cases, and child abuse cases. And I could not adequately function in my job today without an MDT in any and every one of those fields. And I can't imagine a social problem that you can come up with that would not benefit from the use of a multidisciplinary team. So if we're going to have a team, I think any inherent problem with the team is there going to be a hierarchy? Is somebody more important than the other? And with any team, we all come with egos. And this is going to surprise so many of you, but so many times law enforcement has a type A personality. I know, shocking. You didn't see that one coming, right? So does one member of that team, are they more important than any other member of that team? Because we all bring a unique skill set to the table. And as much as I'm saying that the lines blur, we are not completely interchangeable. At no point can I say, I'm tired of being the cop today, I think I'm going to be somebody else. I can't picture myself going over to the hospital and having a doctor say, we're kind of tied up today. Hey, Brad, would you mind seeing patients today? I can say things like, well, I have seen almost every season of Grey's Anatomy, so I think I have some idea of how to do that job. So maybe that wasn't a great example, because I probably could do medicine. You run around, you yell stat, you do that kind of stuff. So how hard can it be? We can't interchange ourselves. And so if I'm the only one who knows how to do what I do on the team, can we set a hierarchy here? Is there one person on that team or one discipline on that team that is more important? And if so, how do we decide that? And so thinking about that, I'm going to use a house building analogy. You've decided you're going to build a house. And instead of hiring a single contractor to build it from vacant lot to your castle, you're going to have to hire individually every single element of building that house. And this is where you're going to figure out that I have absolutely no skill set in house building. So as I come up with the different titles that I think you would need, you're going to need a plumber, you're going to need an electrician, you're going to need a roofer, you're going to need a window installer, you're going to need a wall and floor dude. They probably have a proper title, but I have absolutely no idea what the hell their title is. So the wall and floor dude. You're going to have every one of these people involved in building your house. So now ask yourself, which one's the most important? Who's the most important member of that team? I guess it depends on what you need. If I need electricity, I think it's the electrician. If I'm trying to take a shower or use the bathroom, it's probably the plumber. If it's cold and rainy like it is tonight, it might be the roofer. Every single member of that team is going to be important, and unless they work together, this house is not going to look the way I want it to look. So I am not going to say that there is a hierarchy here, because there really isn't. When I think about what my victims need, what your clients need, that changes every single minute that they're involved in crisis. So yeah, maybe that domestic violence victim needs the police right here, right now, because they have to stop a physical assault, a beating that's taking place right now. Once we've stopped that assault, once we arrive on scene and we solve that problem, the victim doesn't need law enforcement at that moment. Maybe what they really need at that moment now that the actual hitting has stopped, what they really need is a doctor. They need a medical person. They need a nurse. They need somebody to fix the pain. And once that pain is fixed, maybe that's not what's so important anymore. Maybe the next step is going to be social worker who can help them find a safe place to be. So their need is going to shift by minute, depending on where they are in that process. My house is going to need different people at different moments if I'm going to bring it to completion. Whatever I need to solve my current problem. And I can tell you in all honesty, I have never once had a 5-year-old sexual assault victim say, what I'm most interested in is pressing charges at this moment. Just doesn't happen. What they want is what every single person on our client load wants. I want to be safe. I want to be safe right now. And whoever is in the best position at that moment to fulfill that need is who is most important. But what we do all have in common is that we're going to leave. At some point, we're going to be done. We're not going to stay with this thing forever. That's the rule of the game, is that at some point we have to walk out on this person. And how do we prepare them for whatever the next step is? In my opinion, there is one constant in every one of our victim client patient's life, and that is going to be that non-offending parent or the supporting partner or spouse, the supporting family member, the best friend, somebody who is going to be there long-term after we're gone. It makes for a great movie of the week when we on my caseload, I befriend that person, and now for the rest of their lives, me and them are connected and we're friends, and I'll always be there for them. That's a perfect Lifetime movie channel script. It just doesn't happen in the real world. I'm going to walk away from this thing at some point and move on to whatever the next case or call or client is. We are going to leave. And we have to figure out who is going to be there long term. The study there at the bottom, it's 20 years old, and every time I put something that old up, I say to them, you have to ask yourself, really? You can't find anything a little more current? But I am telling you, I have not, in 20 years, found anything to refute that 95 study, that the resilience of a child in sexual abuse, the number one factor determining whether or not that child is going to be able to move forward, to process, and to get on with their life is not going to be the cop, is not going to be the doctor, is not going to be the social worker, is not going to be the therapist. It's going to be a supporting parent, the person who is going to be there long term. With that said, so who else needs to be brought to the table as the multidisciplinary team? It has got to be that support network. We have to, for all practical purposes, make them an auxiliary member of our MDT. We have to teach them and prepare that person, whomever it is going to be, a non-offending parent, a best friend, a spouse, partner, whoever it is going to be. They have to be brought on board, and they have to understand what the long-range effect of this process is going to be and how to bring them through. Even a kid or a person in therapy, at some point the therapist is just not there anymore. They have to have somebody. And they're going to be in crisis too. When you drop a bomb on a family member about what has been happening to their child, to their best friend, to their spouse, to their brother, to their sister, you dropped a bomb on them with this. And they're in crisis, and they have to be brought along. The job, I think, of a multidisciplinary team at this stage is to sort of refocus everybody on that team into the global view. I think the worst part of any individual investigation is that we do lose that global view. I can do my job stone cold perfect. There are so many things in life that I am really sucky at. But arresting bad guys is not one of them. I'm going to tell you, I'm good at it. Got a lot of experience at it. But I can do my job stone cold perfect, and I can arrest a suspect, and I can bring on board a prosecutor who also is perfect at her job, and we can create this prosecution, and we can put a bad guy in jail. But if we do so at the risk of the victim, if we leave behind a fractured family, we're going to be right back where we started at some point. Conversely, best social services worker we have going, and we have everything in play. We have the treatment providers doing a perfect job. The medical people are great. The social worker is great. The advocate is great. The mental health therapist is great. They do their job perfect, but we fall down on the criminal justice side, and we offer absolutely zero justice to this family. I think we're going to end up being back in the exact same spot. And so it is only until we have that more holistic approach of orchestrating the multidisciplinary teams together with the single goal of long-term safety, of healing, and, of justice. We want that. We have to have that. Individually, we can excel, but collectively, it is the sum of our parts that will prevail in giving these victims what they truly need. I think one of the hardest things that an MDT has to teach its members is maybe when to put the brakes on or when to stop. This is, I think, especially hard in the criminal justice process. Balancing the needs of the victim with the needs of the discipline. And I will say, for the most part, this is where prosecutors and attorney generals need the most help from an MDT, is understanding that. We have this of course, we have a societal need to punish abusive behavior. We as a society, we demand, when you're aware of a crime, we want the criminal stopped. We want the criminal prosecuted. But what happens if the pursuit of that justice lends more problem or in some way retards the healing process that victim is going through? Now we have to balance. Is it in fact worth it? And so, what do I mean by that? What would be an example of it's not worth it? And again, real examples. I'll just pull them right from my caseloads. Child sexual abuse. If I'm an offender, if I'm a defense attorney, when's the best time to commit an act of sexual abuse against a minor? Want to guess? 5th grade, 8th grade, 12th grade. In my experience, those are the best grades to do it. Why? Because the following year is a transition year for that person. They're going someplace. They're moving up. They're moving from elementary school to middle school to high school, or the golden one for defense. They're moving from high school to college. So this child has been sexually abused, and it has now been disclosed, and they're on my caseload. And I know that as a high school senior, this is my victim, that the defense is going to figure out some way to delay this process into next September. Why? Because my victim's gone. Because my victim has moved on. And so maybe they live in Tacoma, but now they're going to go to Washington State and they're going to be in Pullman. What's the likelihood that they're going to want to drop what they're doing, leave college in the middle of their first semester, not take tests, not be part of your lesson plans, to come back here and be part of this process? They're going to say, no, I'm done, let me out. And so we have to, at that point, balance. Is it worth pulling them away from where they're at in pursuit of this criminal? And I'm telling you, at times it's not as easy as it sounds. Putting the bad guy in jail might not be the right thing for this individual victim. Delayed disclosures. So you have a case from last week. So we have a 10-year-old who is now disclosing sexual abuse that took place in the city of Tacoma, but the family is now living on the East Coast. She is 10, and she's living on the East Coast with her family. They're in a safe spot. There's no chance that this offender is going to reoffend against this victim. So, that's a consideration. Will this offender offend against others? Perhaps. I have no control over that at this point. But at 10 years old, do we force this child to fly back across the country with their family to be part of this process? Do we force that? How about an adult sexual assault victim, again, from my caseload, who was sexually assaulted by somebody that she had previously been having a consensual affair with? Force that victim to come into court when they say they don't want to? Is it better to stop for the victim's mental health? The domestic violence victim who is finally able to get themselves extricated from that violent relationship and is now, with the help of an advocate and a social worker, in a safe place, someplace other than right here in the city of Tacoma. They're living someplace else. Is it worth it to bring them out of that that safe place that they're in and re-expose them to this system. I mean, for those of you who aren't aware, the government has the ability to issue what's called a material witness warrant. You don't want to come to court? The government can force you to come to court. They can arrest you and hold you in custody to force you to come to court. Can't make you talk, because nobody can make you talk, but they can make you come. Is it worth it? Is it worth it? At some point, do we have to learn to be able to say, it's not, and it's time to stop? That's a pretty hard decision, particularly for people in the criminal justice field, because once we are in pursuit of somebody, we don't want to stop. But it's with the help of an MDT that we learn that maybe it's the right thing to do. Overall, the goals of the MDT, we want to reduce trauma, multiple interviews. That little kid who told Bud Cramer, don't you guys talk to each other? Do you know what it used to look like when I started in this field? If a child reported sexual abuse to a school counselor who came in to talk about whatever, body boundary issues, and nobody gets to touch you in this spot. And then this little kid says, well, wait a second, but Uncle Mikey says that he's my uncle, and he gets to do this to me. So now we have this disclosure. What would we do with that child, a decade or two ago? Well, we would make that child talk to a police officer at the school and tell me what happened. I better get a social worker out here. Then a social worker would come out and look at that kid and say, tell me what happened. And we better get this kid over to Mary Bridge for an exam. So we'd put that kid in the back seat of a police car and drive them to Mary Bridge. And then a doctor would say, tell me what happened. Then we would take them to a police station where they'd meet with a detective. And I would say, tell me what happened. The kid's going to have to tell their story 6, 7, 8 times. We used to do the same thing with sexual assault victims and domestic violence victims, because everybody had to touch this victim in some way to help. There had to be an advocate, a social worker, a medical professional, a treatment provider, a mental health person. The goal of the MDT is to say, you know what, we're not doing this right. Every single time we force victims to retell their story, their confidence in that the story can weaken. So now what we do is we reduce that trauma by saying, you stay put, we're going to come to you. As a team, we are going to come to you. And you're only going to have to talk about this one time, or as many times as you want to, but for our purposes, we're going to do this one time. And we found that the benefits it improves our decision making. For the supervisors out there, it does reduce costs because we are not duplicating efforts anymore. And overall, the use of an MDT enhances the investigation to the point where the safety of the child is greatly enhanced. And I'm not going to talk, I know we have very competent people here who understand and know what trauma looks like. But what I do want to mention about in the interests of dealing with people who are in trauma is first to say, and again, it's something that we strive to talk about on my side of the MDT table. We talk about this at the Academy, is I want officers to understand that trauma, much like beauty, lies in the eyes of the beholder. I cannot say that because I don't think something is traumatic, it isn't traumatic. Oh, I've seen much worse than that, or I've experienced much worse than that. Whatever trauma is, it is. And that's having an MDT helping us to understand that and dealing with what that looks like. All of these behaviors you see may or may not be associated with trauma. They may or may not be involved with the onset of that trauma. But what we do know in working with people who have suffered trauma is that at times it can present itself as behavior issues. When I was in the DV unit, I had a brilliant DV advocate sit me down because I seemed to be, at that point, was just fumbling over myself as to how to talk. I wanted to be able to talk the right way to a victim. And I finally, at one point, had to tell this advocate on the side that I don't like our victim in this case. I just didn't like her. And she said, well, no shit. No shit. And she said, it's the icky victim issue. You're going to have really icky victims. You're going to have people that you wouldn't want to associate with. You're going to have victims who express behaviors that are going to seem, at best, just bad. Or at worst, absolute signs of trauma. You're going to have, and I have kids on my caseload who are cutting. I have kids on my caseload who are stealing, who act out at school, who get themselves in trouble. And when we have those behaviors, or when we have victims who are lashing out because this is finally the first place where they can lash out, where they can speak their mind, they become easy to dismiss because we don't like them, and it's not what we want. We have that, the DV victim who self-medicates with alcohol. Well, of course. If I told you you were going to take, it's, 6:20. If I told you you were going to take a beating tonight at 8, it's coming. There's no doubt, it's coming. Would you rather do it with a little bit on board or sober? Maybe with a little bit on board. And our suspects know that. Our suspects know how to manipulate that, and they know how to make the victim present in an ill light, in the hopes that we, the people who will be working with them, will take that into account and decide maybe we don't want to work with them, and maybe this is a person that just has behavior issues, or maybe it's just flat out mental health and we should just have an MHP deal with this person. Or as the MDT can help us to understand by having that MHP and that therapist on our team, maybe, just maybe, the behaviors that we're seeing, the actions that we're seeing are the result of trauma. And maybe we should be working with that instead. We have to be able to teach ourselves what trauma looks like in our patients and our victims. Because we're going to see it, we're going to deal with it. A brief word about information sharing. This is a hard one for, it's not hard for the majority of the MDT, the social services side. It's really hard for the cops. How do we share information? Do we have to have some sort of professional understanding of what should and shouldn't be shared? Where does confidentiality come in? Is there a difference between a systems-based advocate and a community-based advocate? Of course there is. That systems-based advocate, that one that is hired by the city or hired by the county and works with that domestic violence victim when they go to court, it's a great person, a wonderful resource to have. But they're going to share information with everybody. I can tell you as a cop, and I can tell you to this day, I remember the very first time that happened when I as a patrol officer in the field, dropping an adult female victim off at the Y shelter on Broadway. Taking the victim there, ringing the doorbell. If you've ever seen the building, you ring the doorbell and you take them inside and you hand them off to an advocate, and you kind of go through the process and you make sure that victim understands what the process is going to look like from the criminal side, and that more advocates will be assigned, et cetera, and then you walk away. And I remember that very first time when I'm back at the station and I realized I still have more that I didn't get. I have more information that I need. And I drove back over to the shelter and I rang the same doorbell and I say, I'm here to speak with Miss X. And it was like talking to the CIA. We cannot affirm or deny the existence of Miss X. We have no idea what you're talking about. Well, I know you know what I'm talking about because I was just here 30 minutes ago dropping her off. So I know she's in there. Couldn't tell you. I have no idea what you're talking about, officer. I'm like, there's a camera right there. Rewind the tape. I mean, I'm not the crazy person here. I know what I know. And that frustration level we get with them not wanting to share that information with us. The MDT is what helps us learn how to navigate through that. How do we get information to the people where it needs to be? How do I get information from a victim to sustain my part of this process without yet compromising the other parts of the process? And it's using that MDT to help with that, and understanding what each other's timelines are, and understanding that maybe a priority to law enforcement is somebody is actively shooting right now. Otherwise, it's not a priority. But a priority for a CPS worker might mean that under a mandate, they have 72 hours to make contact with the accused person and the alleged victim and collaterals in that time frame. And so it's learning to work around that and understand what each other is up against, that the MDT can help us with that, putting that puzzle together. Case review, I kind of alluded to that a little bit with Bud, and it's, as you'll notice here, this is not it's a circle. The graphic here, it's not a hierarchy, it's not a chart with somebody at the top. Who does our victim need right now? I think one of the fundamental hallmarks of the MDT process is something called case review. And that's where the professionals come together and talk about that case, talk about what their experience is from a law enforcement standpoint. This is what I've done here. This is where I've been, and this is where I hope to go. Social worker, same thing. Mental health professional, same thing. Advocate, same thing. Doctor, same thing. It sounds easy. Talk about what you did and talk about what we need to do to move forward. The problem is this is probably one of the most difficult parts of the MDT process, because what it turns into is sort of a stand your ground. I did my job to the best of my ability, and now there's people at this table, people in this MDT case review, who are telling me, well, maybe you should have thought about this, or maybe you should have done that. The amount of professional maturity it takes to be part of an MDT, to be able to stand there and have your thought process critiqued and not take it personally. That really, for me, was probably one of the hardest parts of joining an MDT, is recognizing that professional critique is not the same thing as personal critique. Nobody in that room was commenting on me as a person, but what they were commenting on was my thought process, and are we doing what we need to be doing for the victim? That's the hardest part, I think, of that MDT process, and that is case review. Recognize I'm running on time, I'll get there. Cooperating, putting it together. Recognize that most abuse takes place in private. You're not going to see a lot of what your caseload is dealing with taking place in the middle of the mall. It just doesn't happen. Abuse takes place in private. Perpetrators know that it's easier to manipulate a single victim than it is to manipulate a group of witnesses. And they also know that the law favors silence. What do I mean by that? Well, what's the first thing the cops tell you when you're a suspect? You have a constitutional right to shut the hell up. I don't think we're actually supposed to say it like that, but it's something along those lines. I keep forgetting what it is, but it's something about you have the right to remain silent. What happens when people remain silent? Think about the stereotypical child abuse case. You have an infant who has been horribly physically abused. They're not making a statement. You have offenders. Maybe you have a mom and a dad, the only caretakers in place, and they don't make a statement. 0 plus 0 equals 0. We have to, as an MDT, learn to be able to corroborate every little piece of our investigation, every little piece of this process, if we are going to make a case in which most people probably don't want to cooperate with us. Most suspects in abuse cases have a pretty compelling reason to shut up and not talk about what they did. It goes against their self-interest. Having an MDT that understands the dynamics of whatever type of abuse we're looking at, whether it's domestic violence, whether it's child abuse, whether it's sexual assault, commercially sex trafficking, having team members who understand those dynamics can help us begin to corroborate whatever it is we do know about this and put a case together that will result in some type of justice, in long-term healing, and meet those fundamental goals that we have. And there can be, and I get pushback at times on this type of slide from social workers who will tell me that I'm supposed to be solution-based, I am supposed to be client-based, I am supposed to treat, I am not supposed to interrogate, and I so get that. But what you can be is that trust but verify. What you can do is corroborate what people are saying to you. You can have team members who can say, nope, I think what that guy told you was absolute BS. It doesn't work that way. The dynamic doesn't fit that way. The mechanism of injury, according to the doctor on our team, says it doesn't work that way. We trust, but we verify every single thing that's said. And that doesn't make that social worker any less of a social worker. It doesn't make them any less solution-based. It just means I'm not going to be lied to in this process. I'm going to hold people accountable for what they say, for what they do, for what they mean. An investigative bias. Every one of us in here comes in with some investigative bias. We just do. I call it the Pottery Barn parent. I use that. I've been using that term for a couple of years. And what do I mean by that? It's that belief that pretty people can't do bad things in pretty places. That Pottery Barn effect for me, the Pottery Barn parent came from a patrol officer who was sent out we sent this particular officer out to do a welfare check on the house and to do sort of a scene check. We were at the hospital with a family and what was a pretty broken kid. And all the officer could do, come back, wasn't talking about any kind of evidence. All the officer could say and write in his report was that I did go into the house and the bedroom was perfect. It looks like it's right out of a Pottery Barn catalog. Oh, well, if it's that pretty, it couldn't have happened there. And so we become so enamored with the way people present that we forget. We forget we have to follow the action and not the actor. We forget that we follow the facts that present to us and not what the person looks like. I hear presents well almost every time we have a staffing from a new member of our team. And so this was taken from an investigative report. The individual presents well, was cooperative, helpful, charming, nice, clean, well employed, well educated, volunteered, attractive, articulate. How bad could this person be? How bad could they be? This was taken from an investigative report on a guy named Ted Bundy. For those of you who might be a little young, we're looking at 30 murders. So he might have presented well, but he was an asshole. All right? So it's the action. It's not the actor. We follow the facts. I'm going to end up by, I'm going to finish this tonight by talking about this little guy briefly. We won't use his name. We'll call him T. And this is how I met him on an August day. He's 2.5 months old. He's on life support. He had a father who violently hurt him. He had a mother who actively obstructed the investigation to the point where completely tried to hide evidence and to support the father who had beat this child. The only other person he had in his life was, relative-wise, blood relative-wise, was a paternal grandfather who did everything he could to present as indifferent to this child. So that's really all he had. He was dealt a pretty crappy hand in life. And in his 2.5 months before this was taken, that's really all he had until that very moment. And then at that moment, he had a team. He had the Pierce County MDT. He had all of us who were working for him. We certainly wished we could have worked for him before this happened and maybe prevented it, but let's face it, we're a reactionary force. We are not a proactive force because we don't know where it's going to happen next. But from the moment that happened, he did have an MDT. He had a team of doctors at Mary Bridge who did everything they could to keep this little guy alive. He had a medical social worker who made sure that there was always somebody with him so that he was never alone during this process. He had a detective. He had me and my team who were working actively to bring the suspect to justice. And a prosecutor who said we are going to follow the prescribed punishment that is befitting for somebody who hurts a child like that. He had a CPS social worker who worked like hell to find a suitable foster parent for this child because we secured a conviction. So the father was out of the picture. The grandfather was completely indifferent and as the case went on, was far more supportive of his son than of his grandson. And as I said, we had a mom who was actively obstructing this as we went. And so she was not a suitable parent for this child. And then once he was, I'm not going to say healed, but once he came off of life support, he had this social worker who found a foster mother who was willing to take him and learn to work with his special needs and care for him. And she ultimately petitioned the court to adopt him once the parental rights were severed from the abusive parents. And I use this story as an MDT because all of that came together for this little guy from the very moment that he presented at Mary Bridge. This case took 2 years to get to trial. So we don't have the law and order precision that you see on TV. Crime happens at quarter after, arrest 20 after, trial 40 after, verdict at 10-2, and then the news starts. It doesn't work that way. This took 2 years. And he didn't look like that 2 years later. He was profoundly affected. He is tethered and will always be tethered to a wheelchair. He doesn't have the muscle tone anymore. He has no ability to suck or swallow, so it has to be a feeding tube. He has very little eyesight. The goal for him, the long-range goal for him would be maybe at some point he'll learn how to Velcro his shoes together. That's his goal in life. That's what they're thinking about this little guy. And I bring it up because at trial, as is usually the case, the defendant's side was full of people. He had friends, he had fictive kin who decided to show up and lend support to this good guy who just made one simple little mistake. Just the one little mistake. And other than that, Judge, he's a pretty good guy. And as usually the case with these types of cases, the victim side, whether it's a child or a DV victim or whatever, that side of the courtroom tends to be pretty empty. There's nobody there for them. As an MDT, we were there. Every one of us were there to tell the judge. Now, he does have a team. He does have people supporting him. And his foster mother got up to speak, and she had the last word. The judge gave her the opportunity to address the court. And she had him there in his wheelchair, and again, tethered in because he doesn't have the muscle tone to sit up even at 2. And she said, Judge, I just want you to know, and all of these people here have gone completely out of their way to teach me how to care for this little boy, and that's what I will do. I will care for him for the rest of his life. But I want you to know, Judge, that it's October, and it's cold, and it's windy, and it's rainy, and it's muddy, but I took him with the other children, and she had a couple of her own kids, and then she had some relatives that she had this particular October weekend, and she said, I took them to the pumpkin patch out in Puyallup, and so that the kids can pick their pumpkin. And all of the little kids put their rain boots on, and all the little kids were just having a blast, just stomping through the mud and making a complete mess of themselves. But they were laughing, they were joking, and they were just having a blast playing in the mud. And I just want you to know, Judge, that I sat there with this little boy, and I look at that little man over there, that man over there that did this to him, and I want you and everybody in this room to know that he is never going to have muddy boots. And then she turned around and sat down. And I am telling you, there was not a dry eye in that courtroom. Well, there was one, and you know whose dry eye that was. Moron who did it. But the rest of us, that's what being an MDT is working for this kind of thing. I think I went a little long, and I'm sorry, but that's what happens when you hand a cop a microphone. So I certainly will be glad. I'll stick around and answer any questions that you might have or anything that you want to challenge what I did, but I thank you for your time. And I wish you all luck out there, and please, if you're going to be in this field, MDT, be part of it. Be part of it. Thanks.